The Winter Steppe, 12:6, Tao 6. A 3-year-old child screams as leather straps bind him to a saddle. His mother's hands, steady despite their trembling, tie the final knot. The horse beneath him shifts, and the child's terror echoes across the frozen grassland. This is not cruelty. This is curriculum. This is the first lesson in an educational system that would forge the most devastating military force the world had ever witnessed. By age 5, this same child would be shooting arrows. By 16, he would be a fully realized warrior. By 20, he might father dozens of children he would never know, scattered across an empire that stretched from sunrise to sunset. This child is being inducted into something far more systematic than warfare. He is entering a machine designed to manufacture human weapons and spread them across the known world like a plague of steel and sinew. We tell ourselves comfortable stories about the Mongol Empire. We speak of trade routes and religious tolerance, of the Pax Mongolica and cultural exchange. We reduce Genghis Khan to a conqueror, as if conquest were merely about territory. But beneath the Silk Roads and the diplomatic marriages, beneath the innovative military tactics and the efficient postal system, there existed a mechanism so perfectly calibrated to the production and proliferation of warriors that it would leave an indelible mark on the very genetic fabric of humanity. Today, 40 million people carry the chromosomes of this empire. That is not legacy. That is biological imperialism on a scale that defies comprehension. The numbers alone should horrify us. 8% of all men living today in the territories once controlled by the Mongols carry a Y chromosome, marker that traces directly back to a single patrilineal ancestor who lived 1,000 years ago in Mongolia. That ancestor was almost certainly Temujin, the man who would become Genghis Khan. But this genetic shadow is not the result of natural selection or peaceful migration. It is the mathematical outcome of a system that turned reproduction into strategy, childhood into militarization, and human beings into instruments of expansion. What the Mongols created was not merely an empire. It was a biological weapon that fired across generations. Consider the architecture of this system. When Mongol armies swept across Asia and Eastern Europe, they did not simply conquer. They absorbed. They consumed. Enemy soldiers were scattered and redistributed into Mongol units, their tribal loyalties surgically removed and replaced with loyalty to commanders. Women were taken as spoils of war, not randomly, but systematically, with the most beautiful and noble given to the Khan and his generals. Genghis Khan alone maintained a harem that historians estimate contained 500 women. His official wives numbered 44, but this was merely the visible summit of a reproductive pyramid that descended through every level of Mongol society. Each wife had her own dwelling, her own servants, her own income. The senior wives controlled vast resources and wielded political influence. But beneath them, in a carefully structured hierarchy, were hundreds of concubines whose primary function was reproduction. The harem was split into 4 camps, each administered by one of the Khan's principal wives. These were not random arrangements but calculated deployments, with the imperial guard tracking which tent the Khan visited each night. The mathematics are staggering. If we accept the conservative estimate of 120 children attributed to Genghis Khan by tradition, we are looking at a reproductive rate that transforms a single man into a genetic explosion. But historians suggest the real number may have exceeded 1,000 offspring. Each son would inherit not just wealth and position, but the expectation to replicate this reproductive strategy. Each daughter would be married strategically to cement alliances, spreading Mongol genes into royal bloodlines across Eurasia. But the harem system was merely one component of a far more comprehensive program. The production of warriors began before memory, before language, before choice. Mongol children were tied to horses at age 3, their bodies molded to the saddle before their bones had finished forming. This was not harsh parenting. This was systematic physical conditioning, designed to create a symbiosis between human and animal that would produce the most mobile and devastating cavalry force in history. By age 5, these children were given bows. Not toys shaped like bows, but functional weapons scaled to their size. They practiced shooting from horseback until the motion became as natural as breathing. They learned to sleep in the saddle, to hunt at temperatures that would kill untrained humans, to survive on mare's milk and dried meat for weeks at a time. The training was relentless and universal. Both boys and girls learned to ride and shoot, though their ultimate roles would diverge. Boys were shaped into warriors capable of riding for days without rest, of shooting arrows with such precision that they could supposedly fire one arrow high into the air and another horizontally, so that both would strike the same target simultaneously. Girls were trained to manage the logistics of mobile warfare, to drive supply carts, to set up and break down camps with military efficiency. They could ride and shoot, as well as men when necessary. European observers were shocked to see Mongol women carrying quivers and bows, fighting alongside men when circumstances demanded. This was not education. This was programming. The Mongol military machine required not just soldiers, but a complete society optimized for conquest and expansion. Every aspect of life was subordinated to this goal. Marriage was not about love or even family, but about genetic and political strategy. The exogamous marriage system meant that Mongols had to marry outside their immediate clan, which ensured genetic diversity while also creating a web of alliances that could be activated for military purposes. When Temujin needed to build his initial power base, he did not rely on blood relatives, but on the families connected to him through his wife Berta and his strategic marriages. The systematic nature of this reproductive strategy becomes even clearer when we examine how the Mongols treated conquered populations. When a city surrendered, its people might be spared and integrated into the empire. But when a city resisted, the consequences were not merely punitive, but reproductive. The entire population would be destroyed, except for young women and skilled craftsmen. The women would be distributed among Mongol soldiers according to rank, ensuring that Mongol genes would be spread into every conquered population. The craftsmen would be relocated to serve the empire's needs, their skills harvested like any other resource. This was not random violence. This was calculated genetic imperialism. The most chilling aspect of this system was its intersection with military training and organization. Genghis Khan revolutionized warfare by breaking traditional tribal loyalties and reorganizing his armies into decimal units of 10, 100, 10,000. Soldiers from different tribes and even different ethnic groups were mixed together, forcing them to develop new loyalties based on their military unit rather than their birth clan. This same principle applied to reproduction. Women taken from different populations were distributed throughout the Mongol hierarchy, their children raised as Mongols regardless of their mother's origins. The empire was not just conquering territory. It was manufacturing Mongols. Consider the psychological conditioning required to maintain this system. Young boys who had been strapped to horses at age 3, who had spent their entire childhoods training for war, who had been taught that conquest was not just acceptable but glorious. These boys became men who saw the taking of women and the spreading of their seed as natural extensions of their military victories. The normalization began So early that it preceded moral development. By the time these children were old enough to question the system, they had already been shaped by it, their bodies and minds molded to its requirements. The women in this system occupied a complex and often horrifying position. Mongol women of noble birth wielded considerable power. They owned property, managed vast households, served as regents, and occasionally led military campaigns. But this authority existed within a framework that treated reproduction as a state resource. The senior wives managed the Khan's harem like generals managing an army, organizing and deploying reproductive capacity according to political and strategic needs. They participated in a system that reduced thousands of women to breeding stock, their own elevated position dependent on their compliance with this reproductive imperialism. The conquered women faced an even more terrible fate. Torn from their families, distributed like plunder, forced to bear children for the men who had destroyed their worlds, they became unwilling participants in the genetic conquest of their own peoples. The historical record provides glimpses of their suffering. The secret history of the Mongols, the empire's own chronicle, matter-of-factly describes the distribution of women after battles, the assignment of captured wives to victorious soldiers, the systematic rape that followed conquest. These women had no voice in the historical record, except as numbers, as property passed from one owner to another. The scale of this reproductive violence defies comprehension. When the Mongols conquered the Khwarezmid Empire, they killed an estimated 15 million people. The women who survived became genetic vessels for Mongol expansion. When they conquered northern China, the population fell by half during 50 years of Mongol rule, from 120 million to 60 million. Some of this was death by sword and arrow, but much was the slower death of cultural and genetic obliteration, as Mongol genes spread through forced marriages and systematic rape. The efficiency of this system is written in our DNA. Genetic studies have identified several Super Y lineages that spread dramatically during the Mongol period. These are not natural genetic distributions, but the fossilized evidence of reproductive imperialism. The 8% of men in the former Mongol Empire who carry Genghis Khan's Y chromosome represent only the most visible marker. The autosomal DNA, inherited from both parents, tells an even more complex story of genetic mixing and forced reproduction that reshaped the human population of Eurasia. Modern Mongolia still bears the scars of this system. The genetic studies that revealed the extent of Genghis Khan's reproductive legacy also showed that modern Mongols have almost completely lost the ancient northern Eurasian ancestry that once defined their population. The empire that began as a confederation of steppe tribes transformed its own genetic identity through centuries of strategic reproduction and forced mixing. The conquerors were themselves conquered by their own reproductive strategies. The Mongol military training system that began at age 3 was not separate from this reproductive program, but integrated with it. The same boys who were tied to saddles as toddlers would grow up to participate in the systematic taking of women. The same discipline that taught them to shoot arrows with air deadly precision taught them to see reproduction as a form of conquest. The same organizational structure that divided armies into decimal units divided women into hierarchical harems. Every aspect of Mongol society was optimized for expansion, both territorial and genetic. The psychological impact of this system extended far beyond the Mongol Empire itself. The cultures they conquered were forced to adapt to Mongol reproductive practices. In China, the Yuan dynasty maintained the harem system and the practice of taking multiple wives from conquered populations. In Persia, the Ilkhanate continued the tradition of strategic marriages and reproductive alliances. Even after the empire fragmented, its reproductive strategies continued to shape the demographics of Eurasia. The genetic legacy we can measure today is only the most quantifiable aspect of a trauma that rippled through generations. We must understand that what the Mongols created was not an aberration, but an optimization. They took practices that existed in many warrior cultures and systematized them to an unprecedented degree. The taking of women in war, the training of children for combat, the use of marriage for political alliance. These were not Mongol inventions. But the Mongols transformed these practices into a coordinated system of human production that operated with the efficiency of a machine. They turned the human body into technology, childhood into programming, and reproduction into conquest. The lion, Anashtas. Complicity required to maintain this system was total. Every level of Mongol society participated in and benefited from the reproductive imperialism. The Khan's guards, who tracked his nightly visits to different tents, the senior wives who managed, the harems, the military commanders who distributed, captured women among their troops, the families who sent their 3-year-old children to be tied to horses, all were essential components of the machine. There was no position within Mongol society from which one could object to the system without becoming its enemy. The most horrifying aspect is how successful it was. The Mongol Empire lasted only a few centuries, but its genetic impact is permanent. 40 million people today carry the DNA of this systematic reproductive violence. Every one of them is a living monument to a system that turned human beings into breeding stock, children into weapons, and reproduction into warfare. The Mongols did not just conquer the world. They infected it with their genes, spreading their biological material across continents like a virus that replicated through rape and strategic marriage. The training grounds where 3-year-olds were tied to horses were not separate from the tents where women were, kept as breeding stock. They were components of the same system, designed to produce maximum expansion through maximum reproduction. The bow and arrow were weapons of territorial conquest. The penis was a weapon of genetic conquest. Both were wielded with the same strategic precision, the same trained efficiency, the same absence of mercy. Modern humanitarian law prohibits the practices that the Mongols perfected. The Geneva Conventions specifically forbid rape as a weapon of war, the taking of war, civilian hostages, the forced transfer of populations. But these laws exist precisely because humans have proven capable of systematizing such horrors. The Mongol Empire was not unique in its cruelty, but in its efficiency, not in its violence, but in its organization of violence into a reproducible system that operated across generations. The archaeological evidence supports this interpretation. Genetic analysis of burial sites from the Mongol period shows dramatic shifts in population genetics that align with historical accounts of conquest and forced reproduction. The sudden appearance of East Asian genetic markers in European populations, the spread of specific Y chromosome lineages across vast distances, the homogenization of previously distinct genetic groups, all of these point to a systematic program of genetic imperialism that operated alongside military conquest. The Mongols understood something that modern societies prefer to forget, that reproduction is power. They weaponized this understanding, turning the human capacity to create life into an instrument of conquest. They recognized that controlling reproduction meant controlling the future, that spreading their genes was as important as spreading their empire. They created a system where every Mongol warrior was not just a soldier, but a genetic colonist. Every captured woman, not just a slave, but an incubator for future Mongols. The oral traditions of conquered peoples preserve memories of this systematic horror that official histories often sanitize. Stories of villages where all the men were killed and all the women taken, of children who never knew their fathers, of mothers who were forbidden to teach their own languages to their children. These stories are dismissed as folklore, but they preserve truths that genetic science is only now confirming. The Mongol conquest was not just military but biological, not just cultural but genetic. The system required a complete dehumanization of its victims. Women were not people but resources to be harvested and distributed. Children were not individuals but raw material to be shaped into weapons. Entire populations were not communities but genetic stock to be absorbed or eliminated. The Mongol Empire operated on a logic that reduced human beings to their biological functions, their capacity to fight, and their capacity to breed. This dehumanization was facilitated by the nomadic lifestyle that separated Mongols from sedentary populations. The Mongols saw themselves as fundamentally different from the farmers and city dwellers they conquered, as superior beings entitled to take what they wanted. This psychological distance made it easier to treat conquered peoples as livestock, to breed them like animals, to cull them when necessary. The mobility that gave Mongols their military advantage also gave them the psychological distance necessary to operate their reproductive machine without mercy. The fragmentation of the Mongol Empire did not end these practices, but dispersed them. The Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Yuan dynasty in China, each continued versions of the reproductive system they had inherited. The genetic legacy spread even as the political empire fragmented. The system had achieved a kind of immortality, propagating itself through the very genes it had spread across Eurasia. We cannot understand the Mongol Empire without understanding this reproductive dimension. The military conquests were spectacular but temporary. The trade networks were profitable but fragile. The political structures were innovative but unstable. But the genetic conquest was permanent. Long after the last Mongol emperor fell from power, long after the trade routes shifted and the cities rebuilt, the DNA persisted. The true monument to Mongol power is not ruins of cities or ancient trade routes, but the 40 million people who unknowingly carry the genetic evidence of history's most systematic program of reproductive imperialism. The implications extend far beyond historical curiosity. The Mongol system demonstrates how effectively human reproduction can be weaponized when combined with military power and systematic organization. It shows how quickly genetic landscapes can be reshaped through organized violence. It reveals how thin the line is between civilization and biological imperialism, how easily human beings can be reduced to their reproductive capacity when power operates without restraint. Modern DNA testing has made the invisible visible, revealing patterns of ancestry. It tells stories of systematic violence. People discover that they carry the genes of conquerors, and the conquered, that their DNA is a palimpsest of historical trauma. The cheerful marketing of genetic ancestry tests rarely acknowledges that many of the patterns they reveal are fossils of systematic rape and forced reproduction. The Mongol marker that appears in 8% of men across Asia is not a neutral historical curiosity, but evidence of one of history's most successful programs of genetic imperialism. If this story has left you unsettled, if it has revealed a dimension of history that challenges comfortable narratives of cultural exchange and trade routes, then you understand why these truths must be told. Share this video with those who believe history is merely dates and battles, who do not understand that the past lives in our very cells. Subscribe to this channel if you believe that confronting the darkest chapters of human history is essential to understanding who we are and what we are capable of becoming. Only by acknowledging the systematic horrors that humans have inflicted on each other, only by understanding how effectively reproduction can be weaponized and childhood militarized, can we guard against the repetition of such systems. History is not past. It is encoded in our DNA, written in the genes of 40 million people who carry the evidence of an empire that conquered not just land, but the very future of human genetics.